When you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Plaskett, and members of the committee. The focus of today's hearing is allegations of censorship by social media platforms, purportedly at the direction of the federal government. Once again, it bears repeating. The First Amendment applies to governmental restrictions of speech, not private conduct. The plaintiffs in Missouri v. Biden instead argue that the federal government coerced those platforms into censoring disfavored speech through the application of the platform's own content moderation policies. For reasons I detail in my written testimony, that contention lacks a reasonable basis in law and fact. In short, governmental officials offered their suggestions to platforms about misinformation, and no threat of adverse governmental action ever attached to whether those platforms took those suggestions or not. Social media platforms' content moderation decisions have always rested and remain with the platforms themselves. By attacking those platforms' attempts to combat misinformation, the plaintiffs in cases like Missouri v. Biden do disservice to the principles of free speech that they claim to support, and they invite the grave consequences of misinformation that they seek to spread themselves unchecked. It is perhaps not a coincidence that the proponents of measures that would handicap social media platforms' efforts to combat misinformation are often prolific purveyors of misinformation themselves. Senator Schmidt and Attorney General Landry, who just testified, filed a brief in the Supreme Court supporting a suit by the state of Texas seeking to block the counting of electoral votes from 4 states that President Biden won. Over 100 members of Congress, including members of this committee today, also filed briefs supporting that suit. Texas's complaint included a fantastical claim that the statistical likelihood that President Biden fairly won the 2020 election was less than 1 in quadrillion. That is false. Members of this committee have claimed that Dominion voting machines fraudulently flipped votes from Trump to Biden. That is false. Members of this committee have claimed that thousands of ballots were cast on behalf of dead and unqualified voters. That is false. Members of this committee have claimed that election workers around the country counted fake or fraudulent votes. That is false. And on October 19th, 2020, Chairman Jordan tweeted that Democrats are trying to steal the election after the election. That is false. Lies like these corrode Americans' faith in the integrity of our elections and our democracy. Those elections are, without question, fundamentally sound. These falsehoods form the foundation of an unprecedented effort to reverse the results of a presidential election. And they are just a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean of the flood of lies that flooded social media in the weeks and months after the 2020 presidential election. This is not idle political theater. Across the country, election workers have been targeted by extremists with threats of horrific violence as retaliation for their alleged complicity in a stolen election. And just over 2 years ago, a violent mob stormed the Capitol building in an attempt to disrupt Congress's count of electoral votes. Some in that mob erected gallows on the steps of the Capitol not far from where we sit today. After the Vice President honorably confirmed that he would abide by his constitutional duty, some in that mob chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." They did so because someone told them the lie that the election was stolen. And they did so because someone told them the lie that Vice President Pence had the power to reverse the results. Whether or not our Constitution and our fidelity to the principles of the First Amendment permits us to punish or prosecute those who told those lies, surely we can recognize the damage done. And surely we can recognize that the social media platforms, which now serve as the main channels of misinformation, need all the help they can get in combating it. It is both constitutional and consonant with the principles of the First Amendment for government experts to help social media networks in identifying misinformation and to encourage those networks to stop spreading it and amplifying it. I welcome the committee's questions.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Mr. Siegelman, isn't it true that Democrats objected to President George W. Bush's victory in 2000 on the House floor?
Yes, it is.
Isn't it true that Democrats objected to President George W. Bush's victory in 2004?
Yes.
I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Johnson.
I thank the gentlelady. The irony is so thick in the room today that you could cut it with a knife. First of all, the Democrat's sole witness is this gentleman that comes to us from the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School, where less than 2 weeks ago, the dean had to order mandatory training in the First Amendment to faculty and students after her apology for the debacle of them shouting down a Fifth Circuit appellate court judge. Were you present for that event?
No, I was not.
Okay. Well, and you just told us that we basically, the media networks need to censor viewpoints they disagree with. It's unbelievable. The other irony is that our Louisiana Attorney General, Jeff Landry, just explained to us in detail and put on a brilliant presentation with all the evidence pointing out that there is literally a censorship enterprise now in the Biden administration. And not 5 minutes later, our colleagues over here objected and wanted to strike his testimony as being too objectionable. I mean, we're illustrating the point right here as all of you talk. Many actors in the Biden administration, many of them, have and continue to harass and pressure social media companies to censor COVID-19 content. That's just one of the subcategories here that I wanted to drill down on. That doesn't align with their chosen narrative, because when people talk about the origins or the effectiveness of lockdowns or the mask mandates, et cetera, the benefits of natural immunity, they wanted to censor and silence that, and they did. Through the great work, Mr. Sauer, of you and many others in the states of Louisiana and Missouri, we now know that there was a coordinated campaign of both public and private pressure against the social media platforms. And who did it come from? As you pointed out, President Biden himself, senior White House staff, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the CDC. They targeted opposing COVID viewpoints. They targeted the viewpoints, folks. If you're watching at home, they volume censored you. They turned you down, and they kicked people off the platforms because they said things that went against the administration's narrative. One piece of COVID information that President Biden's administration labeled as misinformation was the belief that the virus originated from a lab in China. We now know that is no longer just a theory, it's likely true, as some of the agencies of the government have had to admit now. Dr. Fauci himself was instrumental in contradicting the lab leak discourse from the very beginning of the pandemic. And listen, everybody needs to pay attention to this. He commissioned a research paper to discredit the theory. Can you please share with us what his interest was in covering up the lab leak theory, Mr. Sauer? What do you think about that?
Thank you, Congressman. The evidence in our case indicates that going back to 2011, Dr. Fauci had been a public advocate in favor of gain-of-function research, that starting at least in 2014, NIAID, under his direction, had publicly funded gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and that in early 2020, when the virus was new, he became aware from briefings from his staff and emails from Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Institute in the United Kingdom that there was a grave risk that the virus had, in fact, leaked from that institution where NIAID-funded research on gain-of-function on viruses had been conducted. And you see an elaborate plot, a deceptive plot, to try and discredit that theory at that time.
And NIAID was his agency. When he was asked at a White House briefing about this report that he commissioned, he claimed he was unfamiliar with the authors of the study, even though he was instrumental in every single step of its creation. I have a video, if we can play that real quickly. We'll look at it in his own words. Go ahead. All right, well, they're trying to fix that. What Dr. Fauci says there in his own words is that he has no idea anything about the authors of the study, even though he's the one that orchestrated the whole thing. When he was asked in a deposition about his role in suppressing the lab leak origin theory, among other things, he said, and we have another video, it's not going to work, I'm sure, he said 300-something times that he doesn't recall, he doesn't remember. He isn't the only bad actor. Mr. Sauer, can you please elaborate on the ripple effects of President Biden publicly saying social media companies are killing people by failing to remove COVID information that his party disagrees with?
Evidence indicates that that was a critical watershed in the Biden administration's pressure campaign to attack Facebook in particular, but also social media platforms in 2021. And what you see is these amazing emails right after that July 16, 2021 comment from President Biden that they're killing people, from very senior Facebook, C-suite Facebook executives desperately scrambling to get back in the White House's good graces and assuring them, we will do what you want. We will carry out, quote, what the White House expects of of us on misinformation going forward.
It has an incredible effect at chilling the speech of Americans. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet.
First of all, I want to correct the statement my colleague made that my objections were to the substance or content of the two witnesses that are now departed. My objection, as I stated before, was that if we are not going to observe the right to cross-examine witnesses that are providing substantive testimony before this committee, then we should strike that. And that is the practice in federal courts when much is at stake. And it is a device that ensures that when people take a stand and offer evidence, that we can test the veracity of their statements. But that is not the case in this hearing. The chair and the majority have chosen to allow witnesses to offer substantive testimony here and then have allowed them to scurry away and not face cross-examination or the testing of the statements they have made. You know, it's ironic that we began this hearing with a Pledge of Allegiance. We all stood and put our hands on our hearts and looked at the flag. Then we turned around and we eviscerated the very process here that would protect rights, protect the integrity of this hearing, to elicit the truth and to test the statements and testimony that are brought before us. This is such a departure. This is such a departure from regular order and the usual process of congressional hearings that I'm compelled to strike that, to ask to strike that testimony, because it's not worth anything if it can't be tested. Congress or the American people should not be able to rely on that information if it is not tested, not truthful. And so, Mr. Chairman, I resume my motion to adjourn, and I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman moves to adjourn. The committee will suspend while we prepare to have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Chair, may the time be suspended, please, for that?
It is suspended.
It's still going
Oh,
down.
the clock for Mr. Yeah, we will hold the time for Mr.
Thank
Lynch.
you.
We'll get the clerk out here and we'll have the vote.
Ms. Jordan, point of inquiry.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I've testified before committee even during the 2 years I was out of Congress, and you and I have been here for more than a decade together. Have we ever cross-examined a current U.S. Senator who testified before any committee that you or I were on?
Nope, we have not.
Mr. Chairman, this is
Clerk,
debating the
I
point of
understand.
order.
No, it was
asking
as a
a
point of
question.
inquiry. I just asked the question of the
Clerk
chairman.
will call the roll on the gentleman's motion from Massachusetts.
Mr. Jordan.
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa. No. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Stewart. Ms. Stefanik. No. Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Kamak. Ms. Kamak votes no. Ms. Hageman. Ms. Hageman votes no. Ms. Pascott. Mr. Lynch.
Yes.
Mr. Lynch votes yes. Ms. Sanchez.
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Allred. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Goldman?
Aye.
Mr. Goldman votes aye.
Mr. Chair, how am I recorded?
Ms. Pascott, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Ms. Pascott votes aye. Mr. Stewart, you're not recorded. Mr. Stewart votes no.
All members voted. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, there are 7 ayes and 12 noes.
Motion fails. The gentleman is recognized for the remainder of his 5
Point
minutes
of
of question.
inquiry. Mr. Chairman, point of
The
inquiry.
gentlelady is recognized from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I think we need to unconfuse the record. I mean, sometimes I hear you talk about Mr. Landry as appearing as a former member of Congress, and sometimes I hear you saying was Louisiana Attorney General.
Well, those are both true statements.
Those are two statements, but in what capacity was he testifying today? As a
It's
former
testifying as
member or as an elected state official?
he was testifying as a witness in front of the subcommittee on the weaponization of government. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for his 2
capacity,
minutes
sir?
and 17 seconds remaining in his 5 minutes of
In
questioning.
what capacity, sir?
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I should get an answer in what capacity he was here.
He was in the capacity of a witness in front of our committee. That was his capacity.
Attorney General.
Yeah, the gentleman from Massachusetts is
So
recognized.
is the president now said that any state official that
Precedent's
comes
now
is
set
going to
that
be
the
excused?
gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for the remainder of his 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chairman, I would
Regular order.
answer.
Mr. Seligman, in the Missouri versus Biden complaint, today's witnesses, who are now departed, claimed that a February 2022 Department of Homeland Security threat bulletin somehow harmed them by warning that online disinformation could lead to real physical threats. I ask unanimous consent to introduce this February 7, 2022 National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin. for
Without
the record.
objection.
Mr. Seligman, this warning obviously was not far-fetched, as evidenced by the events of January 6th. Members of the extremist groups like Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and 3%ers did not hesitate in calling for perpetrating violence on the basis of false or misleading election fraud narratives, and we need only to remember the chants of "Hang Mike Pence" outside this U.S. Capitol. I would also underscore that more than 60 lawsuits brought by President Trump and his supporters, especially Rudy Giuliani, following the 2020 presidential election failed because they lacked evidence to support them. Professor Seligman, do you agree that false or misleading narratives about the substantive election fraud could lead to calls for violence around elections?
Yes, I do.
Professor Seligman, the witness that were sitting next to you seemed to think that it is censorship for DHS to warn that online disinformation could lead to election violence. Could you walk us through how disinformation can lead to that election violence?
Yes, Mr. Lynch. So if 100 million people see a false claim about voter fraud or election interference on a social media website, some number of those 100 million people may become outraged to a degree that they are willing to commit acts of violence. And that's exactly what we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, that these false narratives, these false statements of fact about the integrity of the election in 2020 were propagated. Millions, hundreds of millions of people saw them, and some small number of those people took matters into their own hands and committed acts of violence that the members of this committee have seen.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would point out that last Congress, the Democrats ran a committee in that Congress for a year and a half, which gave no ability to the Republicans to cross-examine one single witness. So we do believe the ability to cross-examine is important. We also believe in following the custom.
That's
Mr.
false.
Sauer.
Couldn't question witnesses at a
Mr.
hearing?
Sauer.
You are not allowed to question witnesses at a hearing? Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Sauer, you deposed Dr. Fauci.
Point of order. Mr. Chairman, could you clarify that statement, because I find it incredibly hard to believe.
Point of
What
order,
basis
that's not a
in-
point of order.
What basis in fact do you
Gentlelady has
have
not
for
stated a point of
making
order.
that assertion?
The chair now
Are
represents
we
himself
just
for
here
his
to
5 minutes
allege
of-
wild
5 minutes of
allegations
questioning.
and have no factual
Mr. Sauer,
thing to pick it up?
The gentlewoman has not been recognized. I'd like, Mr. Sauer, you deposed Dr. Fauci last fall? In that deposition, you asked him the question, you said, is it important for people to have access to both sides of the debate so they can assess what's good information and what's bad information? Remember that question you asked Dr. Fauci? And here was his response. He said, Dr. Fauci said, well, you know, it depends. If information is clearly inadequate and statistically not sound, there can be a danger in people who don't have the ability or the experience to understand. Mr. Sauer, do you forfeit your First Amendment rights if you can't tell good information from bad information? That's not how our First Amendment works, is it? You need to turn on your mic if you can, Mr. Sauer. Is the First Amendment only those for those people who have the ability or experience to understand?
No, it is for all Americans.
All Americans, all 330 million of us, is that right?
That's correct.
Not just for the special people, not just for the super smart people like Dr. Fauci, who worked 40 years in our government, highest paid guy. Not just for them, it's for all of us, right?
Absolutely right.
Even if maybe you don't know the difference sometimes between what's good or bad information, you still have your First Amendment liberties under our Constitution.
Both to hear and to speak, absolutely.
Exactly right. By the way, when you deposed Dr. Fauci, how many times did he happen to say he didn't know or couldn't remember?
He said, I do not recall or variations thereof 174 times, and adding in variations if I don't remember at least 212 times.
Wow. Smartest man on the planet couldn't remember 212 times?
He couldn't remember things, including things that he had told the national media, quote, I remember it very well. Then he would say 16 times, I don't recall details of that meeting.
Now, you, you were near the top of your class at Harvard Law School, Rhodes Scholar, is that right, Mr. Sauer?
I've submitted a biographical statement.
Yeah. Well, I looked at your biography. It's pretty impressive. Is that pretty high? You've done a lot of depositions. You've done a lot of legal work. You've deposed a lot of people. Is 212 times pretty high?
I've taken dozens of depositions. I've never seen anything like it, including in this case where other federal government witnesses frequently profess inability to recall.
So the guy who told us all these things, who's, you know, the smartest man on the planet, he set a record. Highest you've ever seen and couldn't recall, didn't remember?
I've never seen anything like it.
Okay, page 4 of your testimony, you talk about the censorship enterprise. You give a bunch of facts and numbers here. You said Twitter disclosed that 84 government officials communicated with them, or as Mr. Seligman said, gave them suggestions. 84 federal officials gave Twitter suggestions on tweets and things to take down. 45 officials in the federal government told the same thing to Facebook. Is that right?
They discussed disinformation and censorship with those officials.
Yeah, a handful of federal agencies handed over 20,000 pages of documents in the communications they had with these big tech companies. Again, just suggestions, though, according to Mr. Seligman. 20 White House officials were involved in these suggestions to these social media platforms.
That's conservative. It's probably higher.
Yeah. FBI agent Elvis Chan testified the FBI alone sends encrypted lists to social media accounts, sometimes containing hundreds of accounts and URLs in each list to platforms for censorship 1 to 5 times per month. 500 times a month, 500 different email or websites, everything else they're sending to these social media platforms. The FBI, and Mr. Seligman says, don't worry, that's not a problem with the First Amendment. That's a suggestion.
Yes, over the course of years that's been occurring.
The Election Integrity Partnership, a censorship consortium of academics, think tanks, federal and state government officials, social media platforms boast that it surveilled 859 million tweets, 21,897,364 tweets on tickets as misinformation. Is that right?
That's correct.
You learned this in your discovery in your lawsuit so far?
Correct, Your Honor.
And the Virality Project, a mass surveillance and censorship operation conducted by the EIP, has done over 6.7 million engagements on social media, 200 million. Now, let me just ask you this. Were most of those targets towards conservatives?
Virtually everything we've seen in evidence so far, or at least the vast majority of what we've seen in so far, is conservative, right-leaning speech.
But you would be just as outraged. I read your testimony. You'd be just as outraged if it was the other way around, right?
Absolutely.
Same here. Same here. Because the First Amendment, again, is not just for some people, not just for one political persuasion, not just for the so-called smart people like Dr. Fauci. It's for 330-some million Americans. That's how our Constitution works. Is that right, Mr. Sauer?
Every single American.